My name is Cora, and at 54 years old, I thought I had learned everything there was to know about standing up for myself. I had built a successful real estate career from nothing after my husband passed 8 years ago, raised my daughter Sarah as a single mother, and saved $170,000 for what I believed would be the wedding of her dreams. I was so proud, so ready to give my only child everything I never had. But sometimes the people closest to you can deliver the cruelest lessons about respect and family loyalty. What happened 3 weeks before Sarah's wedding changed everything I thought I knew about love money and the price of dignity. Before we dive into this story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know your city or country. If this story resonates with you or reminds you of your own family experiences, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, what you are about to hear will make you question everything about family boundaries and financial control. 8 years ago, when my husband David died in that car accident, I never imagined I would rebuild my life so completely. Sarah was just 18 then, about to start college, and I was a stay-at-home mum who had never worked a day in my life. The insurance money helped, but I knew I needed to create a future for both of us. Real estate seemed like a natural fit. I had always loved looking at homes, imagining the stories behind each door, and I discovered I had a gift for understanding what people really wanted in their lives. Those first years were brutal. I studied for my license while Sarah was in her freshman year, working part-time jobs just to keep us afloat. I remember those nights when I would fall asleep over property law books, my highlighter still in my hand, wondering if I was crazy to think I could succeed in such a competitive field. But something drove me forward. Maybe it was the memory of David telling me I could do anything I set my mind to, or maybe it was watching Sarah work just as hard at her studies, determined not to let our circumstances define her future. By Sarah's junior year, I had sold my first $1 million property. By her senior year, I was consistently one of the top agents in our area. The transformation felt miraculous. I went from being financially dependent to financially secure, and with that security came a confidence I had never experienced before. I could provide for my daughter, send her to law school if she wanted, and even start thinking about things like dream weddings and family celebrations. Sarah and I had always been close, but those years of struggling together created an unbreakable bond. She would call me every day from college, sharing her classes, her friends, her dreams of becoming a paralegal, and maybe even a lawyer someday. When she graduated and got that job at Morrison, Keller and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in our city, I felt like we had both made it. We had survived the worst and come out stronger. Then, 3 years ago, Sarah met Trevor Westfield. She came home from work one Friday evening practically glowing, talking about this brilliant young attorney who had just joined the firm. Trevor was everything she had ever dreamed of in a partner. Harvard educated from a prominent family, sophisticated, ambitious. He drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and when he looked at Sarah, she told me it felt like he saw all her potential. I was thrilled for her. After everything we had been through, my daughter deserved someone who would appreciate her intelligence, her work ethic, her kind heart. When she brought Trevor home for Sunday dinner that first time, I pulled out all the stops. I cooked for hours, set the dining room table with my grandmother's china, even bought flowers for the centerpiece. I wanted to make a good impression on this man who had captured my daughter's heart. Trevor seemed polite enough during that first dinner, though I noticed he asked quite a few questions about our house, my work, even the neighborhood we lived in. At the time, I thought he was just showing interest in Sarah's background. trying to understand her family. He complimented the meal, thanked me graciously for having him, and when he looked at Sarah across the table, his affection seemed genuine. Over the following months, as their relationship deepened, I started to notice small things that gave me pause. Trevor would sometimes make comments about Sarah's potential as if she were a project to be developed rather than a person to be loved. He would suggest she upgrade her wardrobe, encourage her to network with a different crowd, even hint that she should consider moving to a more upscale apartment. Sarah would laugh these suggestions off, but I could see they were planting seeds in her mind. When Trevor proposed last December, it was everything a romantic proposal should be. He took Sarah to Chez Laurent, the most expensive French restaurant in the city, got down on one knee with a 3-carat diamond ring that probably cost more than most people make in a year, and asked her to be his wife. Sarah called me from the restaurant parking lot, crying happy tears, barely able to speak through her excitement. I cried too, remembering how I had dreamed of this moment for her since she was a little girl, playing dress-up in my old wedding gown. The engagement party was my first real introduction to Trevor's family. Margaret Westfield, his mother, was everything I had expected from what Trevor had told us about his upbringing. Tall, elegant, perfectly coiffed, wearing what I was certain was a designer dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage. She greeted me politely, but coolly, the kind of politeness that feels more like tolerance than warmth. Trevor's father, Richard, was equally reserved, though he did make an effort to ask about my business. During the party, I overheard Margaret talking to another guest about wedding plans. She mentioned something about making sure everything was done properly, with the right vendors, the right venue, the right guest list. The way she emphasized those words made it clear that she had very specific ideas about what constituted appropriate choices for her son's wedding. That night, as I drove home from the party, I felt a nagging worry that I could not quite name. Sarah had seemed different around Trevor's family, more careful with her words, more conscious of her posture. Even her laugh sounded more restrained. When I mentioned this to her the next day, she brushed off my concerns, saying she just wanted to make a good impression on her future in-laws. A few weeks later, when Sarah and Trevor came over for dinner to discuss wedding plans, I made the offer that I thought would solve everything. I told them I wanted to pay for the wedding, all of it, as my gift to them. I had been saving and investing specifically for this moment, and I had $170,000 set aside for Sarah's wedding. I wanted her to have everything she had ever dreamed of, the kind of celebration that would start their marriage with joy and abundance. The wedding planning process began with such excitement and optimism. We scheduled our first meeting with Elizabeth Morrison, one of the most sought-after wedding planners in our area, and I felt like we were embarking on the adventure of creating something truly magical for Sarah and Trevor's special day. The meeting was held at Elizabeth's gorgeous office downtown, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river and walls covered with photographs of stunning weddings she had orchestrated over the years. Sarah looked radiant as we walked in her engagement ring, catching the afternoon light, her eyes bright with anticipation. Trevor arrived with his mother, which I had not expected but understood. Margaret Westfield swept in wearing what I was sure was a Chanel suit, her silver hair perfectly styled, carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. Elizabeth laid out the preliminary plans for a wedding at Ocean View Manor, the premier venue in our area. The ballroom could accommodate 200 guests, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the coastline, crystal chandeliers, and a reputation for hosting the most elegant celebrations in the region. As Elizabeth described the possibilities for flowers, music, cuisine, and decor, I watched Sarah's face light up with each detail. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. Then the questions about guest lists began. Trevor mentioned that his family would be inviting approximately 100 people, including business associates, family, friends, and relatives from across the country. When Elizabeth asked about my guest list, I began describing the people who had been part of our lives for years. My sister and her family from Oregon, my college roommate who had supported me through David's death, neighbors who had become like family during the difficult years, colleagues from work who had celebrated every milestone with us. I noticed Margaret exchange a glance with Trevor when I mentioned some of these names. She cleared her throat delicately and said, "Of course we want to make sure the guest list reflects the appropriate tone for the celebration." When I asked what she meant, she explained that Trevor's career required them to be mindful of the professional connections they were cultivating, and that weddings often served multiple purposes beyond just celebration. Trevor nodded along with his mother's comments, adding that they wanted to make sure the wedding guest list would be strategic for their future. When Sarah asked what that meant, he explained that many of the partners at his law firm would be attending along with important clients and potential business connections. The way he said it made it sound like the wedding was as much a networking event as a celebration of their love. I felt my first real pang of unease during that meeting. When Elizabeth asked about menu preferences, Margaret immediately began discussing the importance of choosing cuisine that would impress sophisticated palates. She suggested we move away from the comfort food options I had been excited about and toward more upscale choices that would reflect better on the families involved. Sarah, who had always loved simple, hearty meals, found herself agreeing to a 7-course tasting menu featuring items she had never even heard of before. When I gently suggested we might want to include some options that reflected our family's traditions, Margaret smiled that cold smile and said, "Perhaps I should learn more about proper entertaining standards before making suggestions." The tension that had been building during the planning process came to a head 3 weeks later during what Trevor called a clarification meeting about the guest list. He had invited Sarah and me to his penthouse apartment, a stunning space with panoramic city views and furniture that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. Margaret was there when we arrived, positioned in one of the leather armchairs, like she was holding court. Trevor offered us wine, which I declined, sensing this was not going to be a social visit. Sarah accepted a glass, and I noticed her hands were slightly shaking as she took it. Trevor began by saying he appreciated my generous contribution to the wedding, but that he felt we needed to have a serious conversation about expectations and logistics. He explained that after consulting with his parents and thinking carefully about their professional obligations, they had decided to reduce my guest list from 85 people to 20 people. Out of everyone who had been part of our lives, everyone who had supported us through the difficult years, everyone who had celebrated Sarah's achievements and milestones, I was being allowed to invite 20 people to my own daughter's wedding. When I asked for an explanation, Trevor launched into a detailed description of the important people who would be attending from his side. Senior partners from multiple law firms, judges, business leaders, political figures. He explained that these connections were crucial for his career advancement and that the wedding was an opportunity to strengthen these professional relationships. Margaret leaned forward and added that maintaining the right social connections required careful curation of guest lists. She said that mixing different social levels could create awkward situations and that they were simply trying to ensure everyone would be comfortable. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to object to defend our family and friends, to remind Trevor that this was supposed to be about celebrating their love, not advancing his career. Instead, she sat quietly staring into her wine glass, occasionally nodding along with Trevor's explanations. When I pointed out that many of my friends had been looking forward to celebrating with us, that some had already made travel arrangements, Trevor said he was sorry for any inconvenience, but that adult decisions sometimes required disappointing people. Margaret suggested that I could always host a separate, smaller celebration for my personal friends after the official wedding. The conversation continued for over an hour with Trevor and Margaret systematically dismantling every objection I raised. They had answers for everything, explanations that made my concerns sound petty and unreasonable. By the time we left, I felt like I had been run over by a truck. In the car afterward, I tried to talk to Sarah about what had just happened. I asked her how she felt about excluding people who had been like family to us, people who had supported her through college, celebrated her graduation, cheered for her successes. Sarah's response broke my heart. She said that maybe it was time for her to move forward with her life, to embrace new opportunities and new social circles. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the wedding. I was at my office reviewing contracts for a new listing when Trevor called. His tone was different from our previous conversations, more formal, more definitive. He said he needed to inform me of some final adjustments to the wedding arrangements. The adjustments, he explained, involved further reductions to my guest list due to unexpected additions of important business contacts and family obligations. My allocation was being reduced from 20 people to 5. 5 people out of the 150 that Sarah and I had originally planned to invite. When I asked how this was possible, how they could continue to cut my family and friends while adding more of their business associates, Trevor's response was delivered with cold precision. He said, "Mrs. Harrison, I hope you understand that this wedding is about positioning Sarah and me for our future success. We need to prioritize guests who can contribute to our professional and social advancement. Only important people are invited, and unfortunately, that means difficult choices have to be made." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Only important people are invited. The implication was clear and cruel. My family, my friends, the people who had loved and supported us through everything were not important enough to witness my daughter's wedding. Margaret's voice came through the phone in the background, offering her own clarification. She said that I needed to understand the difference between personal sentiment and social reality. These were the standards that Trevor's family lived by, and Sarah would need to adapt to these expectations as part of her new life. Trevor continued explaining that the guest list now included senior partners from 3 different law firms, a federal judge, several major clients, and various business contacts who could be valuable for his career trajectory. The wedding, he said, was an investment in their future success, and every invitation needed to serve that purpose. When I asked to speak to Sarah, Trevor hesitated before handing her the phone. My daughter's voice was tight with emotion, but not the emotion I had expected. Instead of outrage or sadness, Sarah sounded frustrated with me. She said that I was making this situation more difficult than it needed to be, that I was not understanding the bigger picture of what they were trying to accomplish. I tried to explain to Sarah that these people had been part of our lives for years, that they deserved to be included in her celebration, that a wedding should be about love and community, not business networking. Sarah's response was devastating. She said that maybe those people had been important when we had different circumstances, but that her life was changing now, and she needed to think about her future with Trevor. The conversation ended with Trevor taking the phone back and informing me that the final guest list decisions had been made and were not open for further discussion. He thanked me again for my financial contribution and said he hoped I would understand that these choices were being made with the best intentions for everyone involved. After I hung up, I sat in my office for what felt like hours, staring out at the city skyline, trying to process what had just happened. My daughter, the child I had raised to value loyalty and kindness and authentic relationships, had just told me that the people who loved us were not important enough to share in her happiness. That evening, I drove home in a state of numbness that felt almost surreal. The house felt too quiet, too empty, filled with reminders of the daughter I thought I knew and the relationship I thought we had. I found myself looking at photographs covering the mantelpiece, pictures that told the story of our life together. Sarah's graduation from high school, our celebration dinner when she got her job at the law firm, family holidays with my sister's children, birthday parties with friends who had become chosen family. These were the people Trevor and Margaret had dismissed as unimportant. My sister Jenny, who had flown out from Oregon to help me through David's funeral and stayed for 2 weeks to make sure we were okay. My friend Patricia, who had brought us dinner every Tuesday for 6 months after David died because she knew I was too overwhelmed to cook properly. My colleague Michael, who had mentored me through my early years in real estate and celebrated every milestone like it was his own achievement. I thought about all the times these supposedly unimportant people had shown up for us. When Sarah had pneumonia, her sophomore year of college, Patricia had driven 4 hours to help me bring her home and care for her. When I was struggling to close my first major sale and doubting my abilities, Michael had worked with me for hours on presentation strategies and negotiation techniques. When Sarah graduated from college, my sister's whole family had made the trip to celebrate with us, treating Sarah's achievement like a victory for everyone who loved her. These were the relationships that had carried us through the hardest years of our lives. These were the people who had invested in our happiness, our success, our well-being without expecting anything in return, except the joy of being part of our family story. And now, my daughter was willing to exclude them from the most important day of her life because her future in-laws had convinced her they were not sophisticated enough to matter. I realized that I needed to know exactly where I stood financially and legally before making any decisions about how to respond to this situation. The next morning, I called Elizabeth Morrison, the wedding planner, and asked for a detailed breakdown of all expenses and payment schedules. Elizabeth explained that 80% of the total costs, approximately $136,000, had already been paid to secure the venue catering flowers music and other services. The remaining 20%, about $34,000, was scheduled to be paid the week of the wedding. She also informed me about the cancellation policies, which varied by vendor but generally allowed for cancellation with 48 hours notice in exchange for forfeiture of 10% of the total contract value. Then Elizabeth mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said that Trevor had called her the previous week, asking about the process for transferring financial responsibility for the wedding contracts. He had asked whether it was possible to remove my name from the agreements and replace it with his family's information and what documentation would be required for such a change. The conversation with Elizabeth revealed the final piece of the puzzle I had been missing. This was not just about guest lists or social climbing or business networking. Trevor and his family were positioning themselves to take complete control of the wedding I was paying for, to exclude me not just as a host but as a participant, while still expecting me to fund their vision of the perfect social and professional networking event. I spent the weekend in a state of absolute clarity that surprised me with its intensity. I was not angry in the way I had expected to be. Instead, I felt a cold, focused determination that reminded me of those early days building my real estate career when I had to learn to negotiate from a position of strength even when I felt vulnerable. Monday morning, I drove to the bank as soon as it opened. I withdrew the remaining $34,000 in cash from the dedicated wedding account and formally closed the account. Then I called Elizabeth Morrison and informed her that I was cancelling all remaining services, effective immediately. I understood that I would forfeit the 10% cancellation fee, approximately $17,000, but I was prepared to accept that loss. Elizabeth was professional and understanding, though I could hear the surprise in her voice. She confirmed that all vendors would be notified immediately and that any services scheduled for the wedding weekend would be cancelled. She also mentioned that she was required to inform the primary contact for the wedding, which was Trevor, about the cancellation. After completing the financial transactions, I sat in my car in the bank parking lot and wrote an email that I had been composing in my head for days. The message was addressed To Trevor, Sarah, and Margaret and I chose every word carefully. Dear Trevor, Sarah, and Margaret, I began, thank you for making your priorities so clear over the past few weeks. Since only important people are invited to this celebration, I have come to understand that I do not qualify for that designation. Therefore, I am withdrawing my financial contribution to the wedding effective immediately. You are now free to plan your dream wedding with your important people using your important money. I wish you success in creating the kind of celebration that truly reflects your values. Sincerely, Cora. I read the email 3 times before sending it, making sure the tone was professional, rather than emotional, factual, rather than accusatory. I was not trying to hurt them or get revenge. I was simply stepping back and allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their choices. The response was immediate and chaotic. Trevor called within 2 hours, his voice tight with panic, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. When I calmly explained that I was respecting their desire to limit the wedding to important people, he launched into a frantic explanation about misunderstandings and communication problems. Margaret called an hour later, and for the first time since I had met her, she did not sound composed and in control. She accused me of sabotaging my daughter's happiness, of being vindictive and small-minded, of failing to understand the bigger picture of what was best for Sarah's future. When I remained calm and simply repeated that they were free to plan whatever kind of wedding they could afford, she hung up on me. But it was Sarah's call that was the most difficult to receive. My daughter was crying, begging me to reconsider, asking how I could do this to her just 3 days before her wedding. She said that I was ruining the most important day of her life, that I was being cruel and unreasonable, that I was forcing her to choose between her family and her future. I listened to every word she said, and then I asked her a single question. Sarah, honey, when did you decide that the people who love you unconditionally were not important enough to share your happiness? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how far apart we had grown. The aftermath unfolded exactly as I had predicted it would. Trevor spent Tuesday desperately calling venues, trying to find anywhere that could accommodate a wedding for 150 people with less than 48 hours' notice. The few places that had availability were either completely inappropriate for the kind of elegant affair they had been planning, or were priced far beyond what his family could afford on such short notice. Margaret, who had been so confident about proper standards and social expectations, found herself in the humiliating position of having to explain to her friends and business associates that the wedding had been postponed due to unexpected complications. The truth was that Trevor's family, for all their social pretensions and professional connections, did not have anything close to the $153,000 needed to fund the kind of wedding they had been planning. By Wednesday, vendors began calling Trevor directly to confirm cancellation and to arrange return of deposits where applicable. The florist, the caterer, the musicians, the photographer, all of them had to be notified that their services would no longer be needed. Some of these vendors had turned down other bookings for that weekend, and the short notice meant they could not easily replace the lost income. The guest list that had been so carefully curated to include all the right important people now became a source of embarrassment rather than networking opportunity. Trevor had to make dozens of phone calls to partners, judges, clients, and business contacts explaining that the wedding had been cancelled due to circumstances beyond his control. The explanations were awkward and professionally damaging in exactly the way he had been trying to avoid. Sarah called me twice more during those 3 days, alternating between anger and desperation. She accused me of destroying her relationship with Trevor, of embarrassing her in front of his family, of proving that I could not be trusted to support her happiness. But she also begged me to reconsider, to find some way to salvage the situation, to help them create some kind of celebration, even if it was not the original plan. I maintained my position throughout these conversations. I was not angry, I was not vengeful, and I was not trying to control their choices. I was simply no longer willing to fund a celebration that excluded the people I loved and that treated me as an unimportant inconvenience rather than the mother of the bride. By Thursday, Trevor was showing his true character in ways that even Sarah could not ignore. Under pressure, he became angry and blame-focused rather than solution-oriented. He accused me of manipulating the situation, accused Sarah of not managing her family properly, and accused his parents of not adequately preparing for this kind of crisis. Margaret, faced with the social embarrassment of a cancelled wedding and the financial reality of her family's limitations, began making subtle but cutting remarks about Sarah's background and family connections. The warmth and acceptance that had characterized the early days of their relationship were replaced by criticism and disappointment. The wedding that was supposed to launch Trevor and Sarah into their successful future instead became a catalyst that revealed the fundamental problems in their relationship and the conditional nature of his family's acceptance of Sarah. 1 week after the wedding date that never happened, Sarah appeared at my front door on a Sunday morning. She looked exhausted and heartbroken, but also somehow lighter than I had seen her look in months. She was carrying a small suitcase and wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of the carefully styled outfits she had adopted since becoming engaged to Trevor. I opened the door and simply said, "Hi, sweetheart," and she collapsed into my arms, crying. We stood in the doorway for several minutes while she sobbed against my shoulder, and I felt like I was holding my real daughter for the first time in months, not the carefully curated version of herself she had been performing for Trevor's family. When she was finally ready to talk, Sarah told me everything that had happened in the week since the wedding cancellation. Trevor had been furious and humiliating in his anger, blaming her for not controlling me, suggesting that this proved she was not ready for the kind of life he was offering her. He had actually said that maybe his mother was right about the incompatibility of their backgrounds and expectations. Margaret had been even worse, making pointed comments about breeding and class differences, suggesting that perhaps this crisis had revealed fundamental problems that would have surfaced eventually anyway. She had actually told Sarah that a good wife would have prevented this situation by managing her family relationships more effectively. But the moment that opened Sarah's eyes completely came when Trevor suggested they could still have a smaller wedding if Sarah could convince her family to contribute financially while accepting a significantly reduced role in the planning and guest list. He wanted me to pay for a wedding I would barely be allowed to attend, with no input on decisions and no guarantee that my friends and family would be included. Sarah realized in that moment that Trevor did not see her as an equal partner, but as someone whose job was to manage obstacles and provide resources while accepting whatever role he decided she deserved. The man she had fallen in love with had revealed himself to be someone who saw relationships in terms of control and utility rather than mutual respect and genuine partnership. The breakup had been swift and definitive. Sarah moved out of Trevor's apartment the same day, returning the engagement ring and taking only her personal belongings. She said that once she started seeing their relationship clearly, she could not unsee the patterns of manipulation and conditional acceptance that had been there all along. Over the following weeks, we began rebuilding our relationship slowly and carefully. Sarah acknowledged that she had lost herself in the excitement of being chosen by someone like Trevor, someone who seemed to represent everything she thought she wanted in terms of social status and financial security. She apologized for allowing his family to dismiss and exclude the people who had always supported us. I used the money I had saved for her wedding in a different way. We spent 2 weeks in Europe that fall, just the two of us rediscovering our connection and talking through everything that had happened. We visited small towns in France and Italy, stayed in charming bed and breakfasts, ate simple meals at local restaurants, and remembered what it felt like to value experiences over impressions. During those conversations, Sarah told me that losing the wedding had actually freed her to remember what she really wanted in a partner and in a life. She wanted someone who would value her family and friends, someone who would see her background as part of what made her interesting, rather than as something to be overcome or managed. 6 months later, Sarah met David Rodriguez, a public defender who shared her values about justice and service. When she brought him home for dinner, he spent the entire evening asking questions about our family history, expressing genuine interest in our experiences and relationships. He treated me like an important part of Sarah's life rather than an obstacle to be managed. The wedding they are planning now will cost a fraction of what Trevor's celebration would have cost, but it will be filled with people who love them genuinely and unconditionally. My sister is flying in from Oregon, Patricia is helping with the flowers, Michael is walking Sarah down the aisle, and every person on the guest list is there because they care about Sarah and David's happiness rather than their professional connections. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had not withdrawn my support for that first wedding. Sarah might have married Trevor, might have spent years trying to live up to standards that required her to abandon the relationships and values that made her who she was. She might have learned to see our family and friends as embarrassments rather than treasures. The lesson I learned from this experience is that love without respect is not really love at all. Money without dignity is not generosity, it is enabling. And sometimes the most important person you need to stand up for is yourself, even when the people you love most are asking you not to. I hope this story resonates with those of you who have faced difficult family situations or struggled with setting boundaries around respect and dignity. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between keeping peace and standing up for your values? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Please like this video. If it touched your heart, subscribe for more real-life stories about family relationships and life lessons, and share this with anyone who might need to hear about the importance of self-respect and family loyalty. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your dignity is never negotiable, no matter who is asking you to compromise it. May you always have the courage to stand up for what matters most.